Welcome to News in Context. I'm Gina Valeria. In this episode, I talk with Sapna Satagopan, co-founder of Xyza News for Kids, an outlet that provides reliable, relatable, current, and easy-to-understand news and information for tweens and teens. In addition to offering news, Xyza also invites young people to cover the news. Anyone under 18 can become a junior reporter, where you have the opportunity to craft news stories and opinion pieces, engage via polls, and share information about news and events happening near you. Xyza News is primarily print and digital, but I did find a couple audio-video examples online. One junior reporter had the same idea I had.
Hi, I'm Chloe, a junior reporter for Xyza, and today I thought it'd be fun to talk to the people who created Xyza. So let's get started, because I have a bunch of questions to ask.
Junior reporters at Xyza often write their stories. Xyza also creates videos with captions, and every once in a while, there might be a video or audio piece like this one.
Hi, I'm Katie, a junior reporter for Xyza, and I'm reporting the 2018 Winter Olympics, and this is my story. There have been a lot of interesting skaters in the 2018 Winter Olympics pair figure skating. And I had a lot of favorite moments, but this one was one of my favorites. I liked the German pair Aliona Savchenko and Bruno Masso's performance. They had cool moves and also won the gold medal in pairs figure skating. Hooray!
My interview with Sapna covered so much I couldn't fit it all into one 30-minute segment. So this episode is part 1 of 2. Here we focus on what Xyza is and how it connects kids to the news. In part 2, we'll explore how kids, parents, and teachers think about news and how Xyza navigates news and contributes to media literacy and curiosity. Sapna, thank you so much for being with me today.
Absolutely.
First, I actually want to talk about Xyza News, Xyza, which I think is so clever. Tell me a little bit about Xyza.
So Xyza started about 3.5 years ago. Probably the idea started a little bit earlier than that, but it essentially came out of this conversation that I was having with my friend / classmate / co-founder, Joanne, who went with me to business school. And we are both parents and we both live in San Francisco. And one of the questions that we were discussing was, because it was 2016 and we were talking about the news and we were talking about elections and so forth, and where is the real source of news for kids and where does that sit and where does that exist, and how can we find something that's suitable? And I come from India. I grew up in India, and I remember as I was growing up there would be this newspaper, and I think there was also this huge hunger for learning about what's happening in the world, at least India in the 80s, I guess. But there was always this kind of supplement to the newspaper that was for kids, and that wasn't necessarily talking down to kids, but essentially kind of giving them a glimpse into what's happening in the world. And I moved here, 20 years ago, and to me it was surprising that there wasn't something like that. They still exist, but they very much sit in a classroom setting. You have all these magazines that teachers can possibly use, but for a family to have something where parents are following news anyway, like how can they share and discuss that with their kids? It seemed like there was definitely a huge gap there. So we started kind of testing out this idea, essentially asking our parent friends, what do you think? And it always got this reaction where people are like, oh my God, that totally makes sense. There should be something that's news for kids, but I don't know of any. And there was always that kind of like, oh, I don't know if there is anything that I can really kind of mention. And so for us, it was clearly an aha moment where we were like, there needs to be something in this space. So we started kind of working at different ways to share news, and what should it look like, and should it be kind of for a particular age group? Because obviously when we say kids, it's a huge age range. It's essentially 0 to 18. So what we were testing out initially was, what is the sweet spot in terms of where is it that kids are actually interested and curious about news, and what do they have for that age? So essentially that's how Xyza was formed. The idea is to bring news to kids who are in elementary and middle school, older elementary and middle schools. We call them tweens and teens, but essentially those who are starting to kind of be more aware of what's happening around them and asking questions, and provide a way for families to actually thoughtfully discuss news in a way that's relatable to kids, and it makes sense. It's not quite out there.
That's amazing. So many questions, but I actually want to go back to the fact that they have a news supplement for kids in India.
They used to. I think it still exists. And I think the whole idea was essentially it was like a Saturday supplement. And of course, there were like fun games and things. But I think in general, there's always this hunger and interest in learning about what's happening outside of the country. At least in the 80s, that was the case, right? Like India was still a small country, not internationally known then. So it was really interesting because the idea was to share what's happening around us to kids so that you can inspire them and kind of create this interesting connection with the news. And I feel like the counterpart to that, and this is something my co-founder always talks about, like she talks about Schoolhouse Rock as being this ultimate. And when I saw it for the first time, obviously as a grown-up, I was like, this is amazing. It's a shame that there isn't anything that is eventually like, 2018, 2020. What is the 2020 equivalent to something like that? And there's really no big outlet in this space. So that was essentially, and for me, I came at it because I come from a family where my grandfather was a news reporter. He covered the Indian independence. Like he was on the streets, when the country became free. So to me, growing up with those kind of stories about the news and what it actually means to be able to thoughtfully relay news was something that was really kind of deep in me for the longest time. So anyway, all of it came together in this idea and this effort or mission to essentially kind of the next generation needs to be connected to the news, and we want to help make that happen.
Yes, always, but really more now than ever when there is so much need for things like media literacy education. And you're right, I wouldn't have thought of it myself, but Schoolhouse Rock was a moment in time for the U.S., rather than an ongoing effort to engage kids in the news. And that is interesting that stopped. And I was a child when Schoolhouse Rock was there. And it was so meaningful because it really helped me understand processes in a way that it was accessible to me and that I really actually wanted to know.
Right.
Yeah.
Some of the things that we always hear, right? Like when we talk about, we are working on this, that's bringing news to kids. There's always this interesting kind of pause where people are like, but, should kids really know what's happening? And there's an entire segment which is worried that news is big and scary and it's terrible. And there's this other segment that is definitely thinking like, yes, but it's also coming from their kind of personal belief and opinion. And for us, the idea is news should be relatable, but news isn't always one thing. I think we forget. Since 2016, I think we've forgotten that news is more than politics. So when we're talking to kids about news, we're not necessarily trying to talk to them essentially about policies and, what's happening in the world of elections. And we are. But there's also kind of so many fascinating aspects to the news that it's easy to forget that right now. But our goal is bring news to kids and show how fascinating news can be. It's not that boring thing that parents are talking about all the time, because space, science, technology, all of this has so much happening in terms of news. But secondly, to also contextualize it. And I feel like that's kind of, it's kind of our focus, but it's also a harder thing to do, which is, and I always bring up this example of like the Brexit, right? I mean, we actually have this video that breaks down Brexit for kids, but we also talk about it quite a bit. But technically for a kid sitting in, I don't know, Palo Alto or like Mountain View or anywhere like, LA, the idea of Brexit is so far out there. Like, does it really make sense for them, the whole idea of Brexit? But the way we contextualize that is in your school. What if your classroom broke away from your school? Do you have access to the cafeteria? Do you have access to the playground? Do you have access to the library? And the idea is to not necessarily talk about these big concepts that could be too complicated for a kid and frankly not necessarily relatable, but to actually make it relevant in their world. And that's essentially with every kind of news story we share, the goal is always to say, why does this make sense to a kid? Because it teaches you something about the world. It teaches you something about the people behind decisions. It teaches you that there are sides to a story. I mean, how much ever, like, I'm opinionated when it comes to talking about news, and I obviously have my preferences, but to understand that even with things like news, where there can be so many passionate discussions, there are sides to the story. There are people behind these decisions. What makes sense today may not make sense tomorrow. We shared the story about how I think in Hawaii, there were essentially new species introduced, but for a very specific reason. And now it's starting to become more and more of an issue. So, but then it's not necessarily a snapshot in time. People make decisions and it impacts things much later. So for us, providing that context around news and make it relatable is really important. It's really hard to do, but it's definitely really important. And so it's not just talking about, hey, elections happened today and just reporting. It's actually providing that context that we are fixated on.
Right, exactly. And that's really important. Your examples are so amazing. The idea of talking about classrooms and cafeteria, that obviously students can probably get really into that and think about what would that look like? And
Yeah.
how are children or kids or teens receiving the Xyza content?
We started as a downloadable PDF because we were trying to keep our job simple and just focus on, the content. And I think for us, we've been kind of poking around different ways to actually do this. So we started with that and it was great. And then when we actually created we are an ad-free service. So our focus is essentially subscriptions. And so when we started off, okay, how does a subscription look like? It was really interesting. 2017, when we were like, well, of course, it's all going to be digital, right? And then actually we got this pushback where parents were actually interested in receiving a printed newspaper.
No
which
way.
Sounds super counterintuitive. But we also want to keep in mind that the audience is not necessarily all like teenagers. It's a combination of like older elementary kids as well as teenagers as well. So that was a factor in us essentially delivering news in print and online, and as well a mobile app, because who doesn't do mobile, I guess. But I think for us, access was also a big part of it. So we work with school libraries and we work with schools in the middle of Wisconsin, where the whole idea of an iPad for every kid is not necessarily the norm. I think it's easy to think of it as the norm sitting in San Francisco and the Bay Area. Well, of course, everybody must be having, an iPad, just set up in a fantastic way. It's not the case. So for us, access was important. So that is essentially why we chose for Xyza to be a monthly printed newspaper that gets shipped, but also online, which is essentially, on the website as well as mobile. We have kind of poked around and figured out, we're essentially written content. It's news stories, but we're also kind of poking around, for bigger topics. We do focus on some videos that help explain topics a little bit better and a bit more visually, but we're still kind of figuring out, what is a good combination of ways to deliver this. But right now, that this is kind of how we are set up, where it's,
Let's talk about the younger kids first, the older elementary.
Sure.
How do you find that they're engaging with the content or processing it?
When we started, we were just creating kind of these papers and delivering news as news stories, just like a magazine would. And I think for us, the goal was also to keep it fun and interesting. So we introduced elements like, there's a word search and there's like a trivia. And so those were definitely things that the younger audience started to kind of engage with. And I know we have received, it's so funny, we have this news word search in the printed newspaper where like they have to find words and like essentially map it. And we've heard, parents talk about how in the back seat they're sitting and doing that, which is great. But I think I want to say a year and a half back or a couple of years ago, there was this kid who wanted to report on something because she was, I think, going to watch. She was super passionate about the Olympics and she wanted to share like the bobsledding, which I have zero knowledge of. Like, I know it's a sport, I know it's in the Olympics, but she is a passionate kind of follower of bobsledding. And she was like, I really feel like people should know about bobsledding. And we were like, well, share what you are watching the Olympics. You're seeing what's happening. You obviously have favorites and you have, knowledge about this. So what we started to notice was, while the younger audience is focused on kind of the fun news and the trivia and all of that good stuff, the older is started to skew towards being heard. And like they wanted to share their opinions and they wanted to share some of their insights into whatever thing they were passionate about. And not every kid is going to be into bobsledding. We know kids who are sharing kind of like their notes from the climate march that happened last year. And, possibly this year we'll hear from them as well. So not every kid is into everything in the news, but they have their hooks and they have their passion different points. So we are essentially focused on nurturing this and, making sure that whatever they have as their point of view is heard and that they're able to express it based on what's happening in the news. So when we ask questions about, sports, or when we ask questions about, like, what do you think about this particular law that came about, we want to hear from them. And that's definitely coming from the older segment. That's definitely coming from kind of the tweens and the teens. Middle schoolers definitely passionate about things. And so that's kind of how we are seeing the engagement evolve. And our goal is to keep that engagement going. It's not necessarily to provide games, but when you react to something in the news, when you share your opinion, you're essentially pausing to think about it. When you're reading somebody else's opinion or some other kid's opinion, because, it's kids kind of listening to kids here, there is this interest that can potentially develop out of that. So our goal is to always to encourage that and kind of nurture that. So the engagement just widely varies depending on the age, but all is good.
We're talking with Sapna Satagopan, co-founder of Xyza News for Kids. This is part 1 of my interview with Sapna. Hear part 2 next week. And what a great point you make about when you are formulating an opinion, it means you have to think about it.
You do. I mean, I think one of the things, and we always talk about how, especially when we're talking about different sides to our story, even in our team. So we are essentially focused on content, and we are not necessarily a technology company. But my co-founder and I, we come from very different points of view. So we always debate about things like, what is the museum? And I know we were talking about this when things like the Museum of Ice Cream came around. And I was like, well, what is really a museum? Like, should it? So we have these debates happen all the time. And our goal is not necessarily to say one thing is right and one thing is wrong. Like, people make decisions that are relevant with the information that they have, and there are, people who support it and people who are against it. But our goal is to give all of that, give all the sides, and then ask the question, what do you think? Like, what do you think should be happening here? And not necessarily, I mean, it's definitely hard to do with certain topics, but our focus is always provide multiple sides to the story, ask open-ended questions, and get them to think about it. And if they are thinking about it and responding for us that day, it's our win for the day. We're able to actually get kids to think about it. And so our focus is essentially, reading, writing, communication, and all of that. But when you pause to think about something, that moment is what we strive for, essentially, where you're like, oh, you've thought about it. Sure, like, it's your point of view, but you pause to think about it. So that's essentially our goal.
Oh, I love that. You said something else earlier about meeting the students where they are and engaging where their interests lie, which obviously a great strategy. I'm curious, though, so much of the problem with our current news media landscape is, I only want the news that I want.
Yeah.
I don't want to engage across anything that I don't already like.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, is there anything that Xyza is doing to certainly engage kids and bring them in where their interests lie, but expose them to other types of content?
Sure. And I think that's absolutely true. I feel like, especially when we talk about, well, I personally am not a huge sports fan, but I know sports is, big, like basketball, all of that. I feel like, there are definitely passionate people around it. I think for us, we always do this kind of step back to see what is the bigger lesson to be learned here, like what is the bigger topic here. And so when we are thinking about it, the actual category of news is secondary, and like the first point is like, what is the big lesson we are learning, or what is the aha moment, or what is it something that we are learning about the world here. And so when we talk about something presumably as boring as bills that are being passed. There was this whole discussion about late start time for schools so that kids can sleep in. And so for us, it's technically a slightly boring. It's like how a bill is being passed, and it's going to take its time, and there are people who are for it and against it. But the bigger question there is like, what is this idea about sleeping in? Like, there are some people for it and there are some people against it. So for us, the idea of making a news topic, it's called, spinach in the lasagna kind of a thing, or spinach in, your like burger.
Right.
The idea is, you realize at the end of it that you've learned something about sports, but actually you clicked or like you read that article because it was this bigger question about what does standing up for yourself really mean? And then you realize Serena Williams and Colin Kaepernick. And so all of that is getting kind of folded in. But the bigger topic is this kind of question that any kid is probably thinking about, which is like standing up. Like, would you fight for something? And, what does it mean when you get what you want and things like that? So we tend to kind of think about it as a bigger lesson about the world. The fact that it's sports is secondary. The fact that it's technology is like secondary to the whole thing. And so even when we're talking about something like even within tech, what are these old technologies that came about, keyboard and so forth, like what do they mean today? We're actually talking about the history of technology, but then we're actually pulling it to today. And then you have, a mobile phone. So the idea is essentially to think about the lesson or like the bigger story there that has an aha moment. And the category of news is almost secondary to it. So that's essentially kind of the focus with a lot of the news stories, especially when we start to go into spaces which could be perceivably, not that interesting to a kid. It's the idea is what is the fun thing to learn here? And it happens to be sports, or it happens to be politics, or it happens to be, entertainment or whatever it is.
Oh, I love that. I actually approach my teaching in much the same way, thinking about what's going to engage them or get them to be like, oh my gosh. And then obviously the lesson is underneath
And then
that.
the speech comes
Yes.
in. And then the speech is like snuck in there. But that's been interesting to see because it doesn't make us think of categories as much as like, what are the interesting things to share about the world today? Because I think there's always stuff happening in the world that could be fascinating. Even when we talk about things like elections, we talk about it in the context of US, but it's actually, how many elections are happening this, like last year, there were a phenomenal number of elections happening around the world. So we actually created kind of like this map where we were talking about these are the different countries where different elections, and by the way, election is not the same across the world. And so it's kind of interesting because you can really throw a lot of insight into something that you think is a really, straightforward or like boring topic because you're providing some context and some aha moments there about things, how the world works.
You talk a lot about engagement. I guess I want to learn a little bit more about how Xyza works with kids. So you're generating and creating and crafting content, but then there's also this piece where do students get to also contribute content?
Yeah, I want to say it happens in probably 3 different ways. One of them is the fairly simplistic thing that you see in most sites, I guess. So we have a poll. Every week there is a poll it's a topic in the news. It's not necessarily what's your favorite color, but it's actually something that is connected to a news story. So the poll is essentially a simple and easy way where kids can just kind of respond and say, oh yeah, that's what I think. Like, what do you think should be the word of the year? Because I think the Merriam-Webster dictionary, they announced a word of the year and it was they. That was their chosen word of the year. And so our question is what do you think should be the word? So it's a simple, easy way to really get some engagement. So polls and trivias help do that part. Most of our news stories essentially end with a question, and we highlight some of these questions, especially, for us, it's been interesting because we started off, and I think we still think of ourselves as a consumer-facing service. So we're not necessarily thinking of ourselves as, a common core academic curriculum, but we know that there are teachers and there are librarians who are looking for additional resources to share with their students. So for us, one of the things that has been really interesting is asking those open-ended questions towards the end and having it open up to them to say, what do you think about this particular decision? Do you think they should have done this? Why or why not? And so those have always, I think one of the recent questions that we asked was about the age of a candidate who is, in the presidential elections. Does age really matter? Because obviously it's a topic that we're all paying attention to, but is there something too old, or is there such a thing as too young? And so the idea is to make them pause and think about it, not as that particular news story, but to essentially get them to share their opinion. No, actually, there's no such thing as too old. There's no such thing as too young. But those are all opinions and perspectives that we appreciate. So that's kind of the second way. And the third way for us has been really interesting because we want to provide them opportunities to experience things and share it with other people across our reader landscape. For example, when Project Ocean Cleanup launched out of Alameda. It was essentially this guy who was creating this mechanism to clean the oceans, and it was going to launch, and it was a big kind of
Is that the one where he was picking up plastic with the
yes,
surface?
and it actually came back, and it actually launched locally. I mean, we are in the Bay Area, and I think we are so glad that we happen to have met and come up with this in San Francisco, because the opportunities here to be able to kind of, do things like that are just so amazing. So essentially press passes where you can actually go visit and listen and hear things. So we have this program where we essentially offer press passes to interesting events in the news. So when City Arts and Lecture had Misty Copeland come in and speak, we were able to have some of our junior reporters go and listen Daniel Handler when he spoke, or essentially be able to hear from people that are their role models and share like what they learned with the other readers across the community. So essentially kind of being junior reporters in a way. We had kids interview the warriors, and oh my god, that was a moment where I remember there was this kid who was just standing there, and he was just like with his mouth open, he was just staring, and I'm like, you need to move, like we need to keep walking there. But they essentially got to ask questions of what their role models in a way, and so it's providing them opportunities. When you talk to somebody who's sharing their perspective of like environmental like justice or like research, or they're sharing their perspective on Misty Copeland and how being like African American. So essentially for us, it's really interesting because what you're actually doing is you're connecting to the news and what's happening in the world right now. It just seems like this fabulous opportunity. We had kids who went to actually interview when the mayoral elections came about
in San Francisco,
Mark Leno, and they actually got to meet with him and ask him questions. And it was fabulous because we had all these kind of elementary school and middle school aged kids ask him questions, and he was like, where are these questions coming from? And I'm like, I swear we did not coach them in any way. This is just questions that they have. What they're actually doing is connecting with their communities, connecting with what's happening around the world. So the more opportunities we can provide for them to do that, the better. And so we actually have kids who are going this weekend to the Children's Movie Festival in Oakland, where they're going to attend these movie screenings. They're going to watch movies that were on the Oscars, and they're going to essentially be able to meet some of the filmmakers there. And so for us, all of these are opportunities where they're connecting with their community, connecting with what's happening in the world, whether they're interviewing kind of a mayoral candidate or somebody who's kind of like, doing something amazing in the world of ocean cleanup. So that's kind of like our larger kind of effort there, and definitely a little bit more intensive because we're looking to find opportunities where they can actually engage and connect with people, leaders. Obviously, that's something that older kids gravitate to, and they're able to kind of, really, and like there was a youth congress event that happened last year, and we had junior reporters go there and cover it and talk.
Where was it?
It was in San Francisco, which is so interesting. And I think for us, being able to provide these opportunities means that's another way that they can connect to the news. So it's kind of runs the range, but it's also because our audience is so diverse in the age group, at least. So the idea is, what can we provide where we can meet them where they are at? And we're not asking, a 7-year-old to write an essay, but we're asking, a 14-year-old, would you like to interview someone? So there's kind of like providing those opportunities that's powering.
If you're in the Bay Area in San Francisco, you can be a junior reporter. Mm-hmm. How does one get to be a junior reporter?
For us, it's fairly simple. You just sign up. I mean, we are also, it's always interesting because we are a kids-focused organization, but we are still interacting with parents and teachers quite a bit. It's always interesting because when we talk to people about, kids are all on Instagram and they're all on whatever, Snapchat, right? And we're like, well, technically not all kids are supposed to be, first of all, on any of these channels. But for us, parents essentially sign them up to be junior reporters. We need a parental consent at least. And so once they're signed up, they essentially get emails, they get opportunities. So we just send it out to them. We have a junior reporter page on our site where everything gets updated. So that's kind of where they can go to see what's the latest happening. And we feature junior reporters. We feature kind of kids who've shared like really fascinating perspectives. And the idea is to kind of motivate and inspire kids to say, I have an opinion on that too. I would like to share that as well.
You have been listening to News in Context. To find out more about Xyza News for Kids, well, I'll let Xyza junior reporter Chloe tell you.
Hey guys, I love being a junior reporter for Xyza. If you want to join the team, you can email editor@xyzanews.com. Anyone can join the team. And you don't have to be a writer. You can take pictures, record a video, or record something like what I'm doing right now.
And you can hear part 2 of my interview with Sapna next week, or online at newsincontext.net. Music in this episode includes Spring Fling by Track Tribe and The Heist by Silent Partner. In addition to hearing News in Context every Friday at 8:30 a.m. and 6:30 p.m. on KSFP 102.5 in San Francisco, you can hear it on Spotify, Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, Podbean, YouTube, and PRX. We're also on Twitter at News in Context SF, and you can find links to all of that at newsincontext.net. I'm Gina Valeria. Thank you for listening.